Bonjour, je m'appelle Imara Jones. I am the founder and CEO of Translash Media, which is a media organization in the United States that uses journalism and the personal narratives of trans people to center our humanity in a variety of ways and stories through podcasts, through video, through zines, through a written platform, and also social media, because we believe that our stories are the way that we communicate our humanity to the world. And communicating our humanity to the world is the way that we secure our human rights, because it's the way that people are able to see that we are actually just like everyone else with the same desires and the same motivations to live the best lives that we can. And in order to do that, we need to have basic freedoms just like everyone else. And a very simple way that I tell people about Translash is that we tell trans stories to save trans lives. I think in the US that we have a contested media environment. We have, on the one hand, trans shows and stars such as Pose. We have Elliot Page, we have Laverne Cox, we have a lot of figures that are increasingly mainstream. And at the same time, we see platforms that are both considered to be mainstream and non-political, such as HBO, which has Bill Maher, who is center-left, who frequently folds transphobia in terms of what he is saying.
And finally, new rule: if something about the human race is changing at a previously unprecedented rate, we have to at least discuss it. Broken down over time, the LGBT population of America seems to be roughly doubling every generation. According to a recent Gallup poll, less than 1% of Americans born before 1946, that's Joe Biden's generation, identify that way. 2.6% of boomers do, 4.2% of Gen X, 10.5% of millennials, and 20.8% of Gen Z. Which means if we follow this trajectory, we will all be gay in 2054.
And also platforms like Netflix, which ironically host Elliot Page's show, but which platform comedians that are deliberately anti-trans, such as Dave Chappelle and Ricky Gervais. And then on top of that, we have a right-wing media, which is driven by Christian nationalism and the ideas of white supremacy, that use transphobia as a way to build an audience, and that use transphobia as a way to try to gain power. And of course, of those, they are the Daily Wire, they are the Daily Caller, which is less well known but is really influential in right-wing circles in the United States because it's the media arm of an organization called the Heritage Foundation, which is a right-wing think tank in the United States, which has an incredible budget. I believe it's around $300 million a year. And there are other right-wing platforms and figures that amplify those messages that are on Daily Wire and Daily Caller and other places. And so I think that we have a very contested media environment in the United States. And just like the wider trans debate, it's unclear how that plays out. But we know that increasingly what the right-wing platforms have done extremely well is to figure out a way to create an ecosystem and an echo chamber of misinformation about us and to weaponize those stories against us using the internet and using social media, and then using mainstream outlets in the United States like Fox News, which likes to platform right-wing figures around the globe, such as Bolsonaro, who's the president of Brazil, of course, and also the Prime Minister Orban of Hungary, in order to create a global network through media and conversation.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to have with us the Prime Minister of Hungary. Viktor Orban has done a tremendous job in so many different ways, highly respected all over Europe. Probably, like me, a little bit controversial, but that's okay. That's okay. You've done a good job, and you've kept your country safe.
And so I think when it comes to that particular space, we know that the right wing and white nationalists and Christian nationalists are using those platforms incredibly effectively through the creation of this ecosystem, which involves the internet, social media, and then powerful right-wing platforms like Fox News. It's a sort of an iron triangle of transphobia. Trans people need to tell our own stories in all forms, journalistic, nonfiction, and fictional storytelling in all media, because transphobia is the default of society. Transphobia is the default of most people. Transphobia is the default position of most people who make decisions about media across the board. And so the only way to not have transphobic media is for trans people to create it. It's sadly pretty that simple, that we're not going to get different narratives about ourselves until we put those out ourselves. Mainstream outlets that didn't appear to be transphobic recently in the US, powerful ones that are mainstream outlets, seem to be, including the New York Times, including the Washington Post, in odd ways. Which means that there's something about transphobia and the need to comment and weigh in on our issues, which is leaching into mainstream newsrooms. And so this idea that newsrooms, the idea that mainstream media organizations and content providers can be a platform for us without us and without our stories is impossible. That's not going to happen. We have to put out our own media at standards that are high, at standards that anyone in our profession would expect, but that cover our community. I'm reminded during the civil rights movement, for example, in the United States, that journalist organizations, newsrooms, suddenly went looking for black journalists, would take journalists that were covering city politics, for example, and suddenly move them to the national desk so that they could cover civil rights. And why was that? It was because they know that in order to get the proper stories about communities, that you need to have people who understand those communities cover them. It's very basic. But that's not happening on trans issues. We know that a lot of leading media organizations in the United States, journalistic, entertainment, do not have any people in decision-making authority who are trans, which means that there's an inherent bias against us. And so the only way to counteract that bias is by telling our own stories. The other thing, of course, that storytelling does is that it helps us build community. It helps people who are not able to live in large cities like Paris or New York be able to connect with the information and news and voices and ideas that connect them to the wider world. I've had so many people tell me who live in rural areas or people who can't come out because of their family or where they live or their jobs, that having a platform like Translash be a place where they can turn and get the news and content that is able to connect them to their communities is a literal lifeline. So I think both for our own communities, I think both for the wider world, that we have to be creating and generating our own stories and covering our own communities in powerful ways, because that's the only way it's going to get done. So Translash, our core team is around 15 people. Sometimes it grows even larger if we're working on a sort of a film project. But that's around our core number, 12 to 15, depending on the day. But roughly 12 to 15 people work on Translash and what we need. And it is a trans majority team. And everyone who is on our team is, if they are not trans, are directly connected to our community in some way. So they are either the partner of trans people, which we have several members of our team are deeply connected to trans communities through their own activism. So we are overwhelmingly trans majority. I think it's like 75, 80% of our team are actually trans people. And then those who aren't are directly tied to our community in really powerful ways. And one of the reasons why I think that type of diversity matters is because we want to try to create media that speaks to our team, but also, as I said, to get our message through to people who aren't trans. And so sometimes we need people who are in our newsroom, who are creating content, to be able to tell us whether or not that would work or resonate for them, or if they understand that what we're literally saying. Because we all understand each other, but sometimes other people may not understand us. And so we need to have those perspectives in the newsroom. And I think that that's a really key part of what we do. And not only are we diverse in terms of our team, again, an overwhelmingly trans team, but we have a large number of people who are non-binary on our team, of course, people of color, and neurodivergent. People who are on our team. And so I feel really good about our team. And I think that diversity allows us to be able to speak to a wide variety of people. For example, a lot of people in our community are neurodivergent. And there's so many times when we're coming up with ideas or we're coming up with a particular way of communicating on social media, and people on our team will say, that doesn't work for someone who is autistic, or that doesn't work for someone who has neurodivergence. And we adjust what we're doing. And so I think that what we try to do is to get authentic messages about trans people to the widest community as possible. We want to be understood by as many people as possible. And that means that having a team to be able to mirror all that you're trying to do is really, really, really important. So I think that that's why Translash is structured the way that it is. And it helps us be better. We're just a better team because we have people of so many different backgrounds, and we're diverse geographically. We are scattered everywhere in the United States. And so, again, what that means is that we're able to get ideas and recommendations and cover stories about trans people in the southern United States, which is rural and conservative, or the plains states in the middle of the country, or the desert Southwest, because we have people in all those cities. Translash has people in Georgia and in Louisiana and in Nevada and in Arizona. And that's really important as well. So I think that's the way that we're structured. And we take a very team-centered approach to all of our content, where we generate ideas together and we work really hard to collaborate because, again, it's through collaboration that I believe that we get the best ideas. So we are diverse in so many different ways, and we work collaboratively, and those are kind of key ingredients to the way that we work and how we work. What's important to realize about trans communities is that we understand the importance of bodily autonomy like few communities. We understand that freedom starts in our bodies, and we understand that there's no way to have a free society without giving people the freedom to make choices about their body. And not only is that just an experiential reality that all trans people have, but then we have members of our community who need access to abortion and reproductive services. We have people who are trans, specifically trans masculine people, specifically people who are non-binary, for whom this is a personal issue, full stop. And for trans women, the issue of bodily autonomy is really important, for example, because there are places in the world, like Japan, for example, that you can only be considered to be a trans woman if you lose the ability to reproduce, if you lose the ability to generate sperm. And so that's an infringement on bodily autonomy as well, and an infringement on reproductive rights. So for all of those reasons, we created a Translash beginning after an idea that I had late last year. I just became obsessed for some reason about this issue. We created a campaign called Trans Bodies, Trans Choices, which is the umbrella work for all of our bodily autonomy content that we generate. We rolled out Trans Bodies, Trans Choices in March, which is, of course, Trans Month of Visibility, and we did so with 3 short films called Trans Bodies, Trans Choices, which tell the story of trans people and reproductive rights from many of the places that I described, such as the desert Southwest and the South. Those films have been so powerful that they've now have been in multiple film festivals. They'll be in Outfest, which is the largest film festival for LGBTQ content, in July. There'll be others that they've been entered into because of that importance and power of that work. We also did podcasts. We also did written pieces. We also did social media engagement. We also did Instagram Lives because we wanted to reach as many people as possible. And then on top of that, we created the abortion guide and reproductive services guide for our community because we knew that a lot of people were going to be in crisis once the Supreme Court ruling came down. I think that what we have to do is to understand for our community the importance of this issue. We have to raise the volume across the board. Mainstream feminist and reproductive organizations in the United States need to include trans people in their conversations and in their planning about the response to the Supreme Court ruling in order to broaden out the conversation, to make the coalition wider, to also engage groups of color in the same conversation. Because one of the reasons why those organizations are caught off guard and haven't responded effectively in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling, or some of them, the mainstream ones, I'm not talking about all, just talking about the mainstream ones, is because they increasingly became isolated, did not build coalition with trans people, did not build coalition with people of color, which made it easier to isolate and pick them off. And so what we hope is that there's a change in that, and I know that there's an appetite at trans organizations to engage in that conversation and work, but those organizations need effective partners at the mainstream organizations in the United States in order to create a larger coalition in support of bodily autonomy. There's a lot of work to do. I would say two things as a piece of advice to up-and-coming media organizations or other up-and-coming ones, because Translash is so young too, not even 5 years old yet. I think the only thoughts that I would give are really two ones that might be important. I think the first one is to understand what your mission is and to hold to that. To not get distracted by all the people who are going to tell you what you should be doing or all of the offers that you will get to possibly work or to do things with other people that may take you from your core mission. Like, stick to your core mission. Organizations are their values, and so live out what your values are in every way and be really clear about that. And don't be afraid to say no to protect your values. We often feel like we have to say yes to everything, but that's not true. Sometimes the power is in drawing boundaries and in preserving your integrity, which is vital for young organizations. That's why at Translash, I wanted us to become a nonprofit, because I didn't ever want to be tempted by the distraction of partnering with larger media companies or being bought by larger media companies, because I wanted us to be able to center our values first. And I think second is to really think about what your infrastructure looks like. What I mean by that is to really think about how you're growing, how you're developing people, how you're developing your organizations, and to think about sustainability. Because the bad news about our work is that it's not going to go away in any of our lifetimes. There's nothing that any of us are working on with respect to gender identity and using media in order to shift and create new dialogues about gender identity that's going to change in any way during our lifetime. What I've only noticed since beginning this work is that the need for this work continues to grow. And that's because the forces that are trying to push against us, which are united globally in conversation with each other, are pushing even harder and growing stronger and stronger, which means that the need for us is growing stronger and stronger as well. So there has to be a consideration about what we are doing in order to create sustainable organization that can be just as strong and be matching the attempts to erase us move for move in really powerful ways. And that could be hard for trans organizations, for trans people, because we're used to being marginalized and we're used to not having enough resources for anything, and we're used to thinking about ways of always doing more with less. But I think we have to start imagining trying to do more with more, because the needs are only going to grow. There is no one who is going to see this video. There is no one that is making this video that is going to see a time when the need for trans-specific media goes away. It's just not going to happen. So the question is, what are we doing over the long term to get ready for that? And I think that's the second thing that I would advise, is for us all to get ready, because we're still at the extreme beginning of this conversation, which we know that in the United States could change at the drop of a hat, of course, if we get a different Congress or a different president, Or, of course, in France, if there ever was a far-right regime that took power here, things could be very different. So we have to prepare ourselves for the world that we're going to live in, and that's a world where our issues continue to take center stage more and more, and we have to be the ones also there creating and telling the world who we are if we're going to have a future.